Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. This week we mark 58 years since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy as his motorcade drove through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. And yesterday, on the anniversary of that assassination, this was the scene at Dealey Plaza. A small crowd gathered. This red pickup truck drove in circles, proclaiming Trump won 2020, along with a bunch of QAnon slogans. Now, we've mentioned this group before. It's a small group. They're a splinter faction from the fringes of the far-right QAnon movement. In fact, 3 weeks ago, hundreds of members of this cult, for lack of a better word, assembled at Dealey Plaza awaiting the return of John F. Kennedy and his son, JFK Jr., who, of course, died in a plane crash tragically in 1999. They believe the Kennedys are not actually dead and will reveal themselves in order to help reinstate Donald Trump as president. Now, it was supposed to happen at 12:29 p.m. on November 2nd. Obviously, that did not happen, but a hardcore group remains in Dealey Plaza, still waiting for something to happen. The leader of this cult promised, quote, something big yesterday. You could look at all this and be forgiven for thinking the country's going through a bit of a psychotic episode. But of course, look, all kinds of people with all kinds of politics in all kinds of places believe all kinds of bananas things. Probably people watching this, probably I do. So I don't necessarily want to single this group out. The reason they're noteworthy is because their peculiarities and their beliefs are associated with a certain faction of the American right that are adjacent to part of the bigger lie being pushed by the leader of the entire Republican Party. Now, it's worth noting that as berserk as the country's politics seem right now, and they really do, there's also a case to be made. It has just always been like this. We've always had wild fringe elements of political parties and cults and conspiracy theories. In fact, John F. Kennedy was supposed to deliver a speech in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, where he planned to speak out against misinformation and conspiracies. He was supposed to say, in part, quote, ignorance and misinformation can, if allowed to prevail in foreign policy, handicap this country's security. There will always be dissident voices heard in the land expressing opposition without alternative. Those voices are inevitable. But today, other voices are heard in the land, voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality. Doctrines wholly unrelated to reality. Kennedy never got a chance to give that speech. Of course, he was murdered before he reached the venue where he planned to deliver it. And 5,000 copies of this flyer were handed out by the far right in Dallas in the days leading up to Kennedy's 1963 visit. You can see it there. Wanted for treason, it proclaims. Punishment of treason, of course, being death. The rhetoric here is more oriented around the concerns of the moment, Cold War and communism, than some of the modern incarnations of the right. But still, listen for a second, because it all sounds honestly pretty familiar. Here's a quote. He is turning the sovereignty of the U.S. over to the communist-controlled United Nations. How about this one? He has given support and encouragement to the communist-inspired racial riots. He has consistently appointed anti-Christians to federal office. This is pretty standard John Birch Society stuff, of course, the far-right faction of the time. And for the most paranoid militant part of the American right, this is what it sounded. And they've been with us for decades upon decades. You can draw a straight line from those people, the folks that would write, print up, and hand out those flyers, who were handing them out in Dallas in 1963 saying, wanted for treason. You could draw a straight line from that to the modern version and say the person of Alex Jones, the far-right radio host, prominent conspiracy theorist who claims, among many other completely crazy things, that the massacre at Sandy Hook was a false flag. It was staged. He believes a group of powerful elites are plotting to take over the world, and if you get him on the top of the United Nations, he sounds just like the people who printed up those flyers, believe me. Jones was also a key figure pushing the big lie that the election was stolen, and he was pushing it ahead of the insurrection on January 6th. Here he is in Washington on January 5th.
We have only begun to resist the globalists. We have only begun our fight against their tyranny. They have tried to steal this election in front of everyone. And as I told them 20 years ago, I tell them again, I don't know how this is going to end, but if they want to fight, they better believe they've got one.
globalists, the globalist conspiracy, the tyranny of the foreigners. Jones is the ultimate personification of that famous essay by Richard Hofstadter on the, quote, paranoid style in American politics, written in the time of that flyer, the wanted for treason flyer, and President Kennedy's visit to Dallas. Quote, American politics has often been an arena for angry minds. In recent years, we've seen angry minds at work, mainly among extreme right-wingers. But behind this, I believe there's a style of mind that is far from new and that is not necessarily right-wing. I call it the paranoid style simply because no other word adequately evokes a sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy that I have in mind. And while Alex Jones is not handing out flyers, he's been, in fact, exiled from major social media platforms. He's also been found liable in a civil court for the lies he told about Sandy Hook. He is also a person who was coordinating, by his own admission, with then-President Donald Trump's team, a person who had the ear of the most powerful person in the world, who was attempting a coup to keep himself in power. Trump was mobilizing precisely those forces led by Alex Jones, who was there on January 6th, fomenting the big lie, whipping up the crowd. And as you probably heard, Alex Jones was subpoenaed by the January 6th committee yesterday. Today, the committee issued new subpoenas to other figures who are right in line with the Alex Jones paranoid style and with the people who handed out those flyers in 1963 wanted for treason. The subpoenas went to 3 far-right militia or paramilitary groups who the committee says were involved in the planning of the riot on January 6th. They are the Proud Boys International and its chairman, Henry Enrique Tarrio, the Oath Keepers and its president, Elmer Stewart Rhodes, and the First Amendment Praetorian and its chairman, Robert Patrick Lewis. We'll have more on those subpoenas later. The thing that makes this moment different and distinct in American politics, because I think you can see the continuities here, and it's important not to fall prey to the allure of presentism. This country's been around a while. Things have been pretty nuts here for a long time. It's not the presence of people like Alex Jones or people like the group that passed out those flyers in Dallas. It's the fact that one of our two parties is captured by that faction. The beliefs of those extreme fringes are the politics of the man who was president of the United States, who put their conspiracies into motion in his final days in office to attempt the most serious and grave assault on our democracy probably since the Civil War. That sequence of events has now been documented in several books. It's going to be documented in the final report of the committee. There have been some huge news scoops coming out of the latest one, Betrayal, by Jonathan Karl, ABC News. Karl reveals that in an interview after January 6th, Trump showed a total lack of concern for his vice president's safety that day, despite the fact the rioters were chanting "Hang Mike Pence," and Pence had to spend hours hiding from the mob. Karl also reported there are photos of Pence in hiding in an underground parking garage, but Pence would not give permission to publish them. And Karl learned that Donald Trump once asked his director of intelligence to investigate a conspiracy theory that smart thermostats were used to hack into Georgia's voting machines.